I've been looking forward to this a lot because Colin is one of the rare philosophers who manages to pull off a genuine interdisciplinary project. He's got the expertise in philosophy, biology, cognitive science and neuroscience to really help us understand the mind, as you like, or as you might put it, from all angles. A lot of philosophers wave at neuroscience, a lot of neuroscientists wave at philosophers, a lot of biologists wave at philosophy and neuroscience. But it's very difficult to pull off the integrative project, to know enough and be smart enough to combine all the information. And today's project that Colin's going to talk about is something extremely interesting and perhaps something that, if it's not close to our hearts now, might be close to our hearts in the next few decades. Colin will be talking about his new book, Robot Morality. So here he is to tell us a bit more about those ideas for the next 45 minutes. Colin Allen.
Thank you, Philip. Well, thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning here. I'm very pleased to be here and tell you a little bit about this project and this book, Moral Machines, that I've co-authored with Wendell Wallach, who's at the Yale Center for Bioethics. The project raises all sorts of questions and hackles whenever we mention what we're doing. And one of the first questions we always get is, well, didn't Asimov already provide the solution to this? Those of you who are familiar with science fiction will know well Asimov's three laws. And in fact, this answer to the question of how we make machines behave morally or ethically, it has already shown up in some official governmental actions. So the government of South Korea, always wanting to be on the forefront of anything technological, a couple of years ago announced that they would be working on an ethical code for robots, and very explicitly said that they would take inspiration from Asimov's laws. This quote also from Park Ha-young, who's the South Korean Minister of Information, or he's an official at the Ministry of Information and Communications. Imagine if some people treat androids as if the machines were their wives. So there's this suggestion of moral outrage which might happen. That's so ambiguous, I'm not sure I want to go there. But did Asimov, in fact, solve the problem? Well, in his early introduction of the three laws of robotics, the first of which shows up in a story he wrote in 1941 and that was published in 1942, Runaround, it's very clear that Asimov regards his three laws of robotics as a plot device, a way to generate problems and paradoxes. So that story Runaround, the scenario is a couple of astronauts are stranded on a hostile planet, and the material they need to get off the planet is unapproachable by humans, so they order the robot to go get it, and the second law says a robot must obey a human being. The robot approaching this location where this material is needed realizes that if it goes any further, it's going to be destroyed, thus violating the third law, but the second law tells it to do what it's told anyway, and the first law, preventing harm to humans, requires it to go and obtain the material, right? Otherwise, they're going to be stranded there and die. What does it do? It gets stuck in a loop. It's a runaround. It goes round and round and round and gets nowhere. And the two astronauts are left there sort of watching this thing go round in circles around what they need to get off. So it's very clear that this is a plot device. And you don't even need all three laws to generate these kinds of problems. The first law alone will do it. As anybody who's taken an introductory ethics course will know, philosophers love to pose students with problems where whatever you do, somebody's going to come to harm. The classic trolley cases. There's a train hurtling towards 5 people on the track, and by some means or other, you can divert the train or stop it, but it's going to kill somebody, one person instead of 5. What do you do? And clearly, the first law alone will not resolve that situation for you. And even when Asimov adds a 0th law later, that a robot may not injure humanity or through inaction allow humanity to come to harm, that just multiplies the problems. Well, isn't this just fiction? And it's of course, been a trope through much fiction, and there are many ways of casting what the issues are and where we're going with robotics in ways that make it seem as though it is fiction. So fans of Battlestar Galactica will recognize this as one of the artificial intelligent flying fighters. And that is fiction. We don't have anything nearly as sophisticated as that at this point. But this is not science fiction. Right? This is a U.S. Reaper, which is the second edition of the Predator unmanned aerial vehicle, currently operated remotely from a base in Las Vegas, Nevada. Takes at least 4 people to fly one of these things. The military is actively seeking to replace those individuals with software. Their stated purpose at the moment is for training purposes. It's very expensive to train a novice pilot on one of these things because you've got to have 3 experts to fill the other seats. They would like software to take on those roles so that they can train people more rapidly and cheaply. But of course, if you've got software that can fly a simulator, you're pretty close to having software that can fly the thing itself. And there's a myth that people will stay in the loop in making any kill decisions here, but military experts are beginning to recognize that in fact is not the case, that these things are going to be out there doing things where it's not possible to completely oversee all of their actions all of the time. So again, we think of Terminator science fiction, but as a matter of fact, in a number of places, people are working on humanoid robots. In this case, in a more service capacity. This is Honda's Asimo, and it is envisaged in the Japanese context as being something that you might want in your home, as something that you might want to have around elderly people because there aren't enough younger Japanese to look after them. It's a big stated objective of Japanese robotics to try to replace healthcare workers with robots. And I want to emphasize that actually I don't think we should be thinking about this or that it'll become relevant 15 or 20 years down the road. It's actually becoming relevant right now. We are beginning to bring these things into our own day-to-day contexts. And it's not just about killing machines, it's about very trivial kinds of things. So while we're not going to have dogs robotically that we're going to have to train to be housebroken, nevertheless, there are corporations out there that are trying to envisage us forming emotional, affective, engaged relationships with robotic dogs. This is Sony's Aibo, which actually was discontinued a couple of years ago, but I think it'll be back. And these things now cost more on eBay than they did when they were being sold retail. And it's not just hardware robots, it's also software bots. So we are in an environment already where every time you go run a credit card for a purchase, some machine decides whether or not to approve that. There's no direct human oversight of that. If you don't like the decision, you can get on the phone and hopefully talk to a person. But that person is also looking at a computer screen and being guided by what they see on that screen. The program is, in some sense, if not directing, influencing the decisions that they can make on your behalf. And there are a number of other contexts where these kinds of software bots, as they're called, rather than robots, are already in place. So in scheduling maintenance for critical systems. So the top left here is actually a military application for maintenance of military hardware, but it's also being used in electrical power grids and so on. The Bet Angel is supposed to help you make money on the horses, and it's interesting they pose it as an angel. And eBots is a trading software that makes trading decisions on your behalf. And these are widely used and often thought to contribute somewhat to instability of the market because they make very fast decisions and things happen much more quickly than the markets are designed for. Namely, they're designed for human speed decision-making. So among all these things under active development and deployment, not in the future, we have a number of autonomous software agents or bots that are doing buying and selling, that are doing credit approval, etc. And we have also a number of ethical advisory systems that are actually designed to help medical professionals make decisions about patients' rights and professional ethics. And people are working on these, and there's also triage systems for intensive care. So although I talk about robots, I really want to include bots. but robots are more photogenic, so those are the pictures you see. It's hard to take a picture of software. Well, another kind of reaction that we get when we bring up this topic of moral machines, or artificial moral agents, AMAs we abbreviate it, is, well, robots can't really be moral, can they? I mean, they just do what they're told, they don't have any decision-making capacity, they're not conscious, all of these things that we think are important to us. And I want to concede that full-blown human-level moral agency may be 20, 50, 150 years in the future, right? We're not talking about science fiction in this respect. Those are not the kind of systems that I have in mind. What I have instead is systems which we already see are increasing on this autonomy scale. They're making more and more decisions without direct human input. Now, you might go, that's not really autonomy. They don't really have free will. Okay, fine, I don't care about that. The point is they're out there making decisions which affect our lives in possibly negative and possibly positive ways, and yet these systems are on the whole, what I call ethically blind or ethically insensitive. So they're towards the left end of this axis across the bottom. Right? And so the challenge, as I see it, is to try to move things into a more ethically sensitive direction. Make these systems aware of, in the sense of able to process information about, the things that matter to us, morally, ethically, and so on, in terms of welfare. And as we do that, the first thing is you hope that programmers anticipate all of the situations that robots encounter, but that's not going to happen, because we're going to increasingly release these in more and more open environments where it's impossible to completely anticipate everything that will be encountered. So you go from a kind of operational morality where it's all built in from the programmer's end to a kind of what we call functional morality, where the machines themselves have on board the systems that enable them to process the relevant information and act on it accordingly. So we see functional morality as something that's actually within the next 10 to 15 years. Full moral agency, who knows? My co-author Wendell thinks we may never get it. I don't see any reason in principle why we won't, but I also think there's a lot of overstated optimism about that. And in starting this project and writing this book, I was actually inspired a bit by a comment by Rosalind Picard, who runs the Affective Computing Lab at MIT. And this is from her book from about a dozen years ago, where she said, the greater the freedom of a machine, the more it will need moral standards. Well, what does that mean? How do we do that? It's striking, too. Some of you may have seen this book by Peter W. Singer, not the famous Peter Singer of the Australian ethicist, but another Peter Singer, who's almost as famous in the U.S. This book came out with a big splash a couple of months ago, Wired for War. It's striking that although it's all about the ethics of warfare, there's nothing about having the systems themselves have on-board ethical guidance systems. But as we'll see, people are working on that. Another kind of question we get from this project, from this book, is, well, whose standards are we going to implement here? And that's of course, a very difficult question, and it's easy, I think, to start focusing, as often happens in philosophy classes, on all of the hard cases without recognizing that, in fact, there's a lot of easy cases. There are certain standards of behavior that are, if not universal, at least widely agreed to, and that seems like a good basis to build from. And the question is how we acquire those. James Gipps, who was one of the first people to write about the origin of machine or robot morality, drew this rather simplistic cartoon, which I like, because it clearly isn't this simple, all right? What are we going to do? Now, I mentioned that this is a topic that's being taken very seriously in military circles. And Ronald R Kim, who's a professor at Georgia Tech University in the United States, this is another book out within the last month or so you can see this is kind of a hot topic at the moment, on governing lethal behavior in autonomous robots. He's a roboticist with money from the U.S. military to build onboard ethical guidance systems for military robots. There's a lot I actually agree with in Arkim's view, but there are some things that I find rather naive. So this is a quote that actually comes from the technical report that has the same title as the book, but I think it's in the book also, where he says, in the fog of war, it may be anticipated that in the future autonomous robots may be able to perform better than humans. They can be designed without emotions that cloud their judgment or result in anger and frustration with ongoing battlefield events. So the idea is that people get angry and then they do bad things, whereas robots won't get angry. They will be these cold-blooded killers. But because of that, we can actually expect better things from them. I think this is naive because I actually think our emotions are a double-edged thing, a double-edged sword, to continue the military metaphor. So the fact that soldiers get angry actually causes them to fight better in certain circumstances. And there is such a thing as righteous anger, I think, which plays a very important role in preserving justice. You get angry about injustice, and that's what motivates you to do something about it. So it's not clear to me that you can separate off all of the good applications of emotion from the bad applications of emotion. But it highlights for us that ethical decision-making in human beings is not just a matter of following some dry set of rules, but of actually being engaged in some way with the situation at hand. Now, if you imagine, or if I imagine, as we do in the book, me sitting in my office as a philosopher, and in comes an engineer saying, I've been told to build a robot that behaves ethically, what do I do? The likely reaction of most philosophers is going to be to start spouting off some ethical theory and take what we call a top-down approach. So start with the best theories we have, and illustrated here with Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, and of course there are many refinements of that for the philosophers in the audience, and Immanuel Kant's deontological or rights or duty-based view. And think about how we might go about implementing a system that would follow the guidelines that are specified by those theories. And for reasons I don't have time to go into, but we can talk about it during question time, this approach is full of problems. And I'll mention just one, and again, I won't be able to do justice to it in the time available here, but it's what computer scientists call the frame problem, which is that potentially there's so much one needs to take into account in order to compute whether or not one of these theories is being applied correctly, that it couldn't possibly be done in a realistic available amount of time. So there's large computational overhead due to problems of knowing all about the psychology of the people that you're affecting, right? So ethics is about regard for others, and it matters whether or not they're going to get upset at something that I do. That requires some sort of deep understanding of human psychology to know whether or not I'm upsetting you or violating some desire that you have or whatever else you think is morally relevant here. Furthermore, you have to know the effects of actions in the world. So classically, utilitarianism says that it's the greatest good for the greatest number, but actions have ripple effects. They go on indefinitely. So you might be stuck having to compute way out into the future to find out whether or not this is really the best thing to do. And there's always a problem of knowing when you can actually do the computation. Have you gathered enough information yet to be able to make the decision? And we're all familiar with this when buying a car or something. It's not a moral decision, but you can spend weeks wondering whether or not you know enough yet to make a decision, right? And the same thing comes in spades when you try to apply a very formal top-down approach to ethical decision-making. So the alternative is a kind of bottom-up approach that I've already hinted at, but let me say a little bit more about it. The thought that we might be able to design learning machines. It's a very old idea in artificial intelligence, in fact. So Alan Turing, in his seminal article in 1950, Can Machines Think?, said maybe we should build a child robot and have it develop like a normal human being, rather than trying to build an adult from scratch. And that's exactly what you see the project is in this Japanese robotics project that I've got some shots of there. Alternatively, instead of learning, maybe we can evolve systems in artificial evolution using computers as an environment in which we then select the ones that do better by some criteria and build up from there. And also, I've mentioned emotions. Maybe we need systems which actually don't really apply some theory computationally, but have the right kinds of emotional responses. Now, I want to be careful here because I've admitted that they may not have real emotions, but we can model the kinds of emotions, and there's a lot of work going on this, how we get machines to behave as if they have emotions, and use that as a way to guide behavior. So a colleague of mine at Indiana University, Matthias Scheutz, is actually working on robots that disobey, and finds that people will, under certain circumstances, tolerate machines that disobey direct orders. And one of the things that will get them to tolerate such a machine, there's a couple of factors. One is that the robot is perceived as cooperating with you in some way towards some further goal, even though it might reject a particular specific order that you think needs to be done. If you can see that what it did instead actually still serves that goal, then you'll tolerate it. But the other thing he does is, as the situation gets more and more urgent in his experiments, these are with real hardware robots, he raises the voice of the robot, says, "I've got to do this now, I've got to do this now." And people accept when the robot finally goes ahead and does it, having warned you a couple of times, because of this appearance of emotion in the robot. Right? And you can think that's a nasty trick, but it works, and again points to our kind of interaction in this social way that bottom-up approaches emphasize. We think, however, you need some kind of hybrid approach, because after all, we can, after the fact, reflect on whether or not we should have gone along with what seemed to be the right thing to do at the time. And thus we'll need artificial moral agents that manage to maintain this dynamic, flexible morality of bottom-up systems and accommodate all kinds of diverse inputs, but evaluate those actions through top-down principles and perhaps can even explain the decisions that they made in terms of those principles. But again, we're, if not verging, perhaps even fully into long-term, what might be called science fiction at the moment, things that we're still only groping towards in terms of actual systems. So where are we actually at the moment? I'm just going to go through this. I'm not going to go through these individually, but there's a number of projects which we survey in the book which are attempting to build some kind of ethical reasoning or decision-making into machines, and doing it with a variety of different approaches, using logic, deontic logic, or using certain principles that are very widely accepted in medical ethics, as with the MedEthics system, and artificial neural networks, agent-based modeling. These are all terms that I won't have time to explain, but people are tackling this in various different ways. Simultaneously, there are people who are working on these affective, embodied, emotional kinds of reactions that we can build into robots. The two communities are only just beginning to come together. So they're sort of aware of each other's work, but nobody's put all these pieces together. But I think that we're really not talking very far down the line before we see this. And in fact, a student whose committee I was on recently did an experiment in which, using on-screen presentations of a medical patient explaining something to you, the subject, as if you're the doctor, revealing something private, and then asking the subject, would you tell this patient's spouse about this situation? It turned out how that individual looked and moved made a difference to whether people would, in fact, said they would tell the spouse or not. Particularly affected males more than females, interestingly. Male subjects more than female subjects. So we see ways in which the sort of convergence of ethical decision-making and presentational aspects, if you like, of bots and robots, software, virtual systems are beginning to come together. Well, the other question is, well, look, all of this is sort of too horrendous to conceive of. Why don't we just stop it, right? Do we really want these things? And I'm going to sound a bit like a fatalist and say I think it's too late almost to be asking this question. We have things that are heading in this direction. Of course, it's never really too late, but the longer you wait, the more and more difficult it gets. So if I was a little bit more careful, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but for all practical purposes, it may be inevitable. And the logic of it is partly driven by this military robots with things like the U.S. Army's armed robotic vehicles, the Future Combat Systems webpage. They've actually changed their webpage since I took the screenshot, but it's still there. And they are developing ever better and greater unmanned drones. This is their next prototype for a flying autonomous vehicle that will be, you can see a U.S. penny in the diagram up there, so it'll be rather small, but it will also have a surveillance and possibly some other kinds of defensive or offensive capabilities. And the logic of this is very clear because soldiers die, and if you can replace them with robots, that seems like a good thing to do. Right? And so IRobot is actually a corporation that spun off from MIT, Rodney Brooks, that builds everything from the Roomba, which is a robotic vacuum cleaner, to the PackBot, which is a military robot. And as in this quote I've circled, from a private first class in the U.S. Navy, a Marine actually, I believe, you've saved lives today. This particular Marine has a very interesting story because he was in Iraq and they were using a PackBot for mine IED detection, and the PackBot blew up, and that was the PackBot that they named Scooby-Doo after this, and he wrote to the CEO of the company saying, please fix Scooby-Doo, he saved my life. So what we see here is also people bonding with quite non-human looking machines, right? He really felt attached to this thing. Now, clearly, there'll be ups and downs on this, and a recent story, 2007 story, I mentioned in Japan the big attempt to get robots into eldercare. Some of the initial experiments haven't been entirely successful. Robots turn off senior citizens in aging Japan, this says in this Reuters story. I like the last comment, stuffed animals are more popular, she remarked dryly. But those are just technological problems to be solved, the degree of attachment, the degree of interactive activity. Plus, we're working with a generation of older people at the moment who didn't grow up with texting and all these other gadgets and so on, right? So when this generation gets to be that age, I think they're going to be much more interested in the interactive devices than the stuffed toys. So, last couple of slides, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. But what are the worries? Well, I think it's not this worry of a robot takeover. Another interesting book from a couple of years ago, humorously written, How to Survive a Robot Uprising. The technology, this book is full of interesting ideas, like if the robots are coming for you, run upstairs. There are clearly physical domain problems, operating physical domain problems for robots. But actually, those are being solved. I'd urge you to go look on YouTube for the big dog robot, and you will be astounded just how flexible this is over varied terrain, even on ice, keeping its balance while carrying a heavy load. So those problems are going to be solved. But actually, I think more pressing, though, than the fear of a robot takeover. We'll have plenty of time to stop that. I think we have these more pressing worries. One is, as was mentioned in the introduction, that we could have some large-scale catastrophe due to crude ethical assessments being made by these machines. They're not sensitive to the right things, they're only sensitive to some of the things, and you can imagine a shooting incident or something like this where the situation wasn't taken into account properly. A big issue here is reduction of human autonomy. What are we doing by, as it were, depending on these machines to make decisions or to guide our decisions, and unintended effects. And the fellow from the ministry in South Korea is not all that far off in wondering what will happen if people start to treat robots like their spouses. And in fact, this is another recent book by David Levy, who wrote a whole dissertation on what I think is still science fiction, which is sort of formal marriage and relationship with robots. But anybody who keeps track on how technology and the pornographic industry have interacted will know that pornography has driven technology from the very beginning, even from facsimile machines before there were telephones. And so we have a situation where these kinds of things are also being rapidly pushed. So finally, I want to just leave you with a question, my second to last slide, what does the project of creating robots say about us? We're in a situation now where we are, instead of looking at animals and trying to understand ourselves in comparison to them being the most similar things in nature to us, we are creating things in our own images. Those are the things that are going to be more similar to us in the future. And so it's an interesting aspect of our own nature or psychology which makes us want to do this, an act of self-understanding. And we suggest in the book, actually this whole project of thinking through how you might build moral machines really makes us think hard about what it even means to be moral, what it means to be ethical, and what the role of ethical theory is. So I want to end just by inviting you to take a look at our blog site, moralmachines.blogspot.com, where we try to keep track of some of the latest developments that are going on, and you can find out more about the book and read some of the chapters, and feel free to post some comments. Thank you very much.